When your best friend becomes a mortal enemy all because of a simple misunderstanding which is entirely their problem, life can get a teeny-weeny bit more miserable than it already is. Jungmin is more than familiar with this story. In fact, this is her story. We begin in a classroom. The teacher was just rounding up his class when he called out to the boss president, our main character, Jungmin. She answered with a smile, and the teacher asked the rest of the class to pay attention while he dishes out instructions. Afterwards, the students echoed their thank you, and the class came to an end. Jungmin was still packing up her stuff at her desk when a classmate called out to her and asked what she'd be doing after school. Jungmin didn't have any plans, so her classmate asked her to tag along and go makeup shopping with the clique. Jungmin thought it sounded good and agreed. She even offered to take the clique out to dinner after shopping, as she had her mom's card with her. Her friends were excited. One of them wished she had a mom like Jungmin's, and the other asked her to stop dreaming. Jungmin looked in the corner at a strange-looking girl who was making a weird crunching sound. Her name was Ju Hyun-ha. She observed the girl for a while in silence before her two friends followed her line of sight and noticed the strange girl. One looked at the girl's disheveled hair and noticed she hadn't showered before coming to school, as had become her habit. The strange girl was really filthy, and it didn't help her case that she bit her nails off until she bled. Really nasty. That was why no one in the class liked her. Jungmin looked at her in silence for a while until her eyes lit up brightly with an idea. This girl was just so filthy. As if she could feel the heat of their stares, the girl stopped biting her nails and looked over her shoulder at Jungmin. When their eyes met, hers squinted into a cold glare. This didn't really sit well with Jungmin's friends, who instantly challenged her to stop it. Jungmin's lips curled up in a smirk, and she began walking towards the strange, filthy girl. Once she got to the girl's desk, she quickly snatched her phone without warning, so the girl couldn't react until it was already too late. When Ju Hyun-ha tried to wrestle the phone out of Jungmin's grasp, she merely swatted the girl away and scrolled through without regard for her privacy. And her eyes lit up when she found what she'd apparently been looking for. She quickly shoved the phone in Juyun's face and said she'd been sure Juyun would do as she'd predicted. On the screen of the phone, there was a flood of nasty hate comments from students online for Jungmin and her friends. Her friends quickly swept the phone into their hands to look at the comments, and once they realized they were the subject, they turned on Juyun immediately. Juyun was frightened and shook with fear. Then suddenly, the sound of hand-kissing flesh filled the air, causing everyone to turn back in surprise. Jungmin slapped Juyun hard, leaving her stunned in disbelief. She slowly lifted her hand up to her cheek and began trembling with fear. All over the class, the students murmured and gasped in surprise at Jungmin's display. Some found it hilarious even. Some wondered what Juyun had gone and done to make the almighty class president slap her. But they mostly laughed, and laughed, and laughed at the girl. Jungmin called out to Juyun and asked her if she was upset. She was sure Juyun was upset. Jungmin admitted that she and her friends had been the ones to bully the girl to begin with. But here she was getting publicly humiliated for trying to speak up. She should have just shut up. Jungmin wasn't done talking. She walked in closer to Juyun so that their faces were almost touching, and she roared in her face that she did the same thing to her every single day. She didn't spare her words as she insulted her harshly. But wait a minute. Jungmin had been dreaming the whole time. The birds chirping over her head through the windows woke her up, and she covered her eyes to keep out the light. She was back to reality. She'd really been enjoying the dream. Once she was ready to leave for school, Jungmin walked over to the piggy bank in the corner and discovered that it was empty. She couldn't afford to eat. Jungmin already dreaded school. Jungmin walked through the hallway with her eyes down to the floor. When she looked up, her eyes met with none other than her mortal enemies, Juyun. Juyun's head snapped in her direction instantly, and she didn't look exactly pleased. Jungmin shrunk at the spot. She cussed in instant anxiety as the realization hit her. Jungmin looked at them, trembling in fear as she calculated the dreadfully long distance from where she stood and her desk. Juyun and her clique began whispering among themselves while stealing glances at her. She wondered what they were talking about, but she couldn't make out their words. It felt so annoying to be kept in the dark. It felt powerless, unlike in her dreams. In her dreams, the three girls would have been toast already. She braved the challenge, hung her head low, and swiftly breezed past them. She'd made it a couple of steps away from them already when she caught hints of their conversation. They were positive that something smelled bad, and that it was coming from inside the classroom. Then Juyun looked over her shoulder at Jungmin and said she had the feeling the smell was coming from the spot where she was. Jungmin felt the sound of their laughter grind against her ears, and she felt horrible. Much later in the day, during a class, the teacher called out to Junyoon towards the end of the class, almost like Jungmin had dreamed about it. The teacher passed an instruction to Junyoon, and she thanked him as the class came to an end shortly afterwards. The empty hallways were soon filled with students walking in every direction. Jungmin walked from bathroom to bathroom, looking for an empty one, and when she couldn't find anyone for students, she considered going down to the staff bathroom. Luckily, it was empty, and Jungmin quietly let herself into a stall as she bemoaned her ill fate at the hands of her classmates. She thought they were all dickheads, but she had no worries, because it was only a matter of time before every one of them would be beneath her. She gave herself some pep talk in the privacy of the bathroom stall. There was no need to be scared of them because they were all high schoolers like herself, but it was hard convincing herself anyway. Jungmin couldn't wrap her head around the fact that the only revenge she ever got on people who hurt her was in her lucid dreams. She wished she could swap her position with Junyoon Ha's and make her suffer everything she'd had to endure. That was the only way she could get a break, because Junyoon had been the one who initiated the whole thing about isolating Jungmin. But things hadn't always been that way. In primary school, the two girls were best friends. Their little friendship began when Jungmin walked into class one day and spotted Junyoon sitting alone at the front row. She asked her friends why Junyoon was alone, and they explained that she'd fought with her friends. When Jungmin asked to know what they'd fought over, her friends couldn't say, but they knew how bad Junyoon's personality was. It couldn't be far from the reason why she'd fought with her friends. Another said she knew Junyoon to be cocky. The girl had used cuss words at her to be fair. But Jungmin was still moved with compassion for Junyoon Ha. She walked over to her and said hi. Then she invited her to join her and her friends to go to the bathroom. They became very close after that. They were always with each other. Until one day, Junyoon asked her not to play with some mutual friends of theirs because she thought they weren't worth the effort. But Jungmin didn't see why she'd want her to leave her friends. What exactly was wrong with them? Junyoon explained that they were a bunch of losers who Jungmin didn't have to play with when she had her. Junyoon hadn't always been like that. In fact, it took a while into their friendship for Jungmin to know her true character. She made Jungmin promise she was never going to play with the other kids, and even though she was initially hesitant, Jungmin eventually gave in. Jungmin recalled the rumors she'd heard about Junyoon. Now she could see for herself that they were all true. But that wasn't the last time Junyoon would influence Jungmin to do something wrong. This one time, they were together in class, and Junyoon was trying to draw over Jungmin's eyes with an eye pencil. Jungmin was nervous and didn't think it was a good idea, but her friend convinced her that she could trust her instead of worrying over nothing. She even asked Jungmin to tie her hair back to match the look. As skeptical as she was, Jungmin let Junyoon do her thing on her face. When Junyoon was done, Jungmin looked unrecognizable. Not the good type. Everyone who saw her looked in disbelief, asked what was wrong with her face. They wondered who was responsible, but immediately suspected it was Junyoon Ha. She'd really crossed a limit this time. Jungmin struggled to hold back the tears, but they came down anyway. And her friends, the same ones she'd been asked to leave, comforted her. Jungmin revealed that Junyoon had asked her to stop playing with them. She'd insisted they could all play together, but Junyoon wouldn't hear of it. One of her friends was so shocked, she asked if Junyoon had actually lost her mind. Hadn't they tried to be accommodating to her when her other friends abandoned her? They ultimately asked Jungmin to stop playing with Junyoon instead, but Jungmin was hesitant. One of her friends pointed out the harsh truth to Jungmin. She really didn't like Junyoon either. There was no reason to fear Junyoon or what she could do if Jungmin stopped hanging with her. Plus, who cared if Junyoon wanted to make a fuss about everything? Certainly not them, because they were glad to be by her side always. And she was on theirs too. Except, Jungmin couldn't just bring herself to cut Junyoon off like that. She was too scared. Even with the support of her friends, Jungmin was so scared of Junyoon. She could already see the signs her friends were pointing out about Junyoon. The thing about what she liked to say, and her personality. Jungmin and her friends walked back to class together and were welcomed by a waiting Junyoon. Apparently, she'd been searching all over the place for Jungmin. Jungmin was a ball of racking nerves. It was obvious she was tense because Junyoon, as aloof as she could be, assumed she'd washed her face. Jungmin's friends quickly used their bodies to form a shield around her. Junyoon soon caught wind of what was happening, and she approached the little human barricade surrounding Jungmin. She tried to reach through the girls and pull out Jungmin, but they were one step ahead. She was shoved backward before she could even touch Jungmin's hand. Then Jungmin's friends warned her never to play with her again. Junhyun was shocked. Then they told her that they'd heard about her little plan to keep Jungmin from playing with them. They'd heard everything from Jungmin herself. Junhyun was shell-shocked and frozen with disbelief. She asked Jungmin if she'd told the girls everything and demanded to know if she'd been talking with them secretly. Jungmin wondered if she'd really gone behind Junhyun's back to discuss her and whether she was wrong or right, but her friends made that decision for her and declared that she wanted nothing to do with Junhyun anymore. After that, they led her away, circling around her like a barricade. As they walked further and further away from a dejected Junhyun, Jungmin could only wonder if they'd done the right thing. Jungmin stole a glance over her shoulder and flinched in surprise at the sight of Junhyun in the distance. And that was the last time they ever spoke to each other. Junhyun never said a word to her after that. Jungmin had expected some harassment from her, but even Junhyun knew she couldn't do anything to her. After leaving primary school, her middle school years were pretty much normal. But by the time she got to high school, Junhyun had totally transformed. She'd become someone no one could ignore, no matter who you were. You can imagine how shocked Jungmin must have been to see this girl she'd run away from as a primary schooler all those years ago. And boy, did Junhyun have a hell of an aura around. Once she saw Jungmin, she shifted her seat backward with a loud slide and walked past her like she was a total stranger. No, like she was a complete ghost. Non-existent. Jungmin was initially confused. She'd wondered if Junhyun didn't recognize her at all, but she figured it was probably for the best anyway. She was even grateful to God. If only she knew. Jungmin could still picture the dejected look on Junhyun's face all those many years ago in primary school. She was glad to see Junhyun was doing pretty well anyway, even though she looked quite scary. It was that aura. Even though she had her back facing the corner where Junhyun and a group of friends were discussing, Jungmin could feel the heat of her eyes on her back. Soon, it was sports time and everyone was gathered around on the field. They were asked to find a stretching partner and line up. Jungmin instantly realized that even though it was still a new semester, a lot of students had made friends and were all paired up already. She was the odd one out, and it made her feel so awkward. She was scared the other students would think she was weird. And just as she was fighting her internal battles, she noticed Junhyun and another girl in the corner, looking at her and talking between themselves. Junhyun turned to whisper something into her friend's ear, and they didn't bother to hide the rest of their conversation afterwards. Jungmin instantly had the feeling that she was the subject of their discussion. At that moment, Jungmin was more than convinced that her high-chill life was going to be a living hell. Junhyun had recognized her the whole time. Sometime after sports day, Jungmin was in class typing away on her phone when she felt a liking presence around her. She looked up and jumped with a start as she saw two girls from her class. She didn't know what they'd want with her, but they wasted no time getting down to business. They confronted her about bullying Junhyun back in primary school. Funny enough, they didn't even find her worthy of the crime. They thought she was too pathetic for it. But not so surprisingly, Jungmin had absolutely no idea what the girls were talking about. They thought she was mad and needed to be in a psychiatric ward for an offense she was innocent of. Jungmin was still reeling in shock as she looked up in the distance and spotted Junhyun. Was it possible that Junhyun had twisted the story to her friends? One of the girls connected to Jungmin's hotspot and threatened to kill her if she turned it off. Jungmin couldn't retaliate or stop them. She was far too outnumbered. All she could do was wonder why she had to be treated so. Everyone in the class was gossiping about her already. And there, Junhyun was in the distance, a devilish smirk on her face as she enjoyed the scene before her. Jungmin felt her skin crawl with dread as reality sank in. She was going to endure bullying at the hands of Junhyun's minions. That became the usual routine for her from that day. Jungmin got tired of it all. She wished she didn't have to go to school again. The things she'd only seen happen to others were now her own problem. What mistake could she have made to deserve a life of abuse? As she crouched in a corner of her room, Jungmin replayed the words those girls had said to her on her first day. The thoughts couldn't stay away, no matter how hard she tried. She was slowly going crazy. She rose to her feet and walked to the door. She walked up to another door, opened it, and peeked into the room. Her mother? She'd been drinking again. Jungmin told her that she wanted to talk to her about something concerning her school life. Her mother kept silent, most likely still under the influence of alcohol. While she was about to pour out her heart to her mother, Jungmin wondered if it'd actually be any good to do so. Would her mother even listen? She found it hard to even take care of herself. Jungmin stood by the door, her mind playing back the comments she'd seen online about her issue. Then she realized there was no point in speaking to her mother about it. She waved it off and left the room. She went back to bed, and while she was scrolling through her phone, her eyes caught an article online that surprised her. She couldn't believe her eyes. It was an article about how possible it was to create an alternate reality in your sleep through lucid dreams. Jungmin instantly figured that if it was possible, then she could do whatever she wished to Junhyun and her minions. It really excited her. She carried on reading and learned about 2 ways she could make a lucid dream work. She first had to create a dream inside her dream, and try having a lucid dream from a conscious state. The article advised against the second option wasn't advisable for beginners because it always left them dizzy. But Jungmin threw caution to the wind. All she wanted was to escape her reality by any means possible. And when she gave it a try, she closed her eyes and opened them in her classroom. She was in a mix of shock and confusion, and then disbelief. She couldn't believe that she'd actually succeeded at lucid dreaming. Her senses felt so real, nothing like they would have in a normal dream. It was her first time ever trying out lucid dreaming, so the details seemed hard to grasp completely. But she figured it was probably because she never really got to look at the other girls in her class or took note of their names in the first place. But there was one person she could never have any trouble remembering. Junhyun. She walked over to her and began a very sincere conversation. She confessed that when she'd first seen Junhyun with her friends, she'd been relieved because she saw that she had a lot of people around her unlike their primary school days. Jungmin still felt bad for leaving Junhyun even though her personality was awful. But she had to ask Junhyun if all she'd had to suffer at both her hands and those of her minions weren't too much in comparison. Did she really hurt her that much? Junhyun kept quiet the whole time, even as Jungmin desperately pleaded for her to say something. Jungmin slipped into frustrated rage and grabbed Junhyun violently as she shook her for a word. Anything at all. The more Jungmin spoke, the more the words flowed from her in the dream. She accused Junhyun of keeping her school life the way it was. Even as she begged Junhyun for answers, she knew deep in her heart that the version of her self-acclaimed hater before her wasn't real. Jungmin slid to her knees on the floor in exasperation. While she cried her eyes out on the floor, Jungmin wondered what she really wanted to hear from Junhyun. In school the following day, the teacher asked them for their homeworks and picked a random girl he called number 1 to help gather them after the class. She moaned about being chosen out of everyone else, but her friend cheered her up and offered to help her so they could go to the canteen afterwards. She asked how many she'd picked up from the class, and her friend told her she'd gone as far as 29. Her friend said all that was left was the number 30. Number 1 was curious to know who student number 30 was, and they sighed in a hint of disappointment as they read Jungmin's name on the cover page. Jungmin was in class, only a few desks ahead. They flashed her skeptical glances before approaching her and asking for hers. Jungmin Choi lifted her empty eyes up to number 1 before searching her bag for her homework and handing it to the girl, who looked quite uncomfortable with the whole situation. She couldn't help but wonder if Jungmin always looked so lifeless. 1 week after she began lucid dreaming, Jungmin started experiencing fatigue in the daytime because she hardly slept at night. And she was more frustrated by the fact that she only ever called out to Junhyun Ha in these dreams and yelled hateful words at her. She hadn't gotten any better revenge on her. Junhyun still kept silent in her dreams. Jungmin figured this was because since she controlled everything in the dream, including Junhyun, she couldn't get her to speak because she had nothing to say to her. Or do to her as well. She wondered if it was because she didn't resent the girl enough, or maybe she was just too scared of hitting another person. Junhyun was still the same girl she'd pitied when they were younger, and Jungmin knew she couldn't hurt her. She smacked her hand against her head in regret about giving up her sleep for nothing. She just wanted it all to stop. Nothing could change Junhyun anyway. Later in class that day, the teacher called for the students to pick their president. One of Junhyun's minions shot her hand up in the air and began calling for the teacher's attention. But the teacher wouldn't let her volunteer because she had a reputation for laziness. The class burst out laughing as the girl said she'd not meant to volunteer but to nominate Junhyun. Jungmin flinched in surprise. The teacher seemed to agree with Junhyun's nomination because of her studying and leadership skills. Even Junhyun was surprised that she was considered. The teacher asked if she could take up the role for the semester. Junhyun pinched her friend's cheek as she asked if the teacher would rather have the class vote for someone who wanted the job. But all over the class, everyone was asking her to just take the role since nobody wanted it anyway. They clapped and chanted her name to Jungmin's dismay. In Jungmin's heart, all she could do was wonder if things would have been different if she'd never left Junhyun's side back in primary school. Maybe she'd have enjoyed the moment with Junhyun as well. As the thought crossed her mind, Jungmin felt very pathetic. The teacher announced that Jungmin was the class president for the semester and asked if she was okay with it. Of course she said yes. Much later. Jungmin opened her eyes and lifted her head up from the desk. The class was empty. She looked at the time on her phone and realized it was lunchtime. She rose to head for the canteen. As she was about to round a bend, she heard someone talking to Jungmin, one of her minions. The girl asked if Jungmin didn't fancy taking out her revenge on Jungmin. Another girl who'd never heard about Jungmin Choi asked who she was and learned that she'd bullied Jungmin back in primary school. Jungmin's heart pounded in terror as realization set in. She had more enemies now. Another girl asked if they could help Jungmin execute the revenge plan if she was finding it difficult, but Jungmin declined in false modesty. She explained that people like Jungmin were loners and she didn't want anything to do with her anyway. Her friends laughed in agreement. One of the girls reasoned that Jungmin looked pretty gloomy and probably had an equally trashy personality as well. They'd even predicted she wouldn't have any friends. One of them asked why Jungmin was mean to Jungmin while she reached for a cigarette from another. Jungmin revealed that Jungmin had approached and was nice to her until her friends ganged up. She believed it was because Jungmin had been gossiping about her with them. Her friends instantly scooped up the story and sympathized with her for being nice, even though she must have felt hurt. In summary, they encouraged her to be mean to Jungmin because she had to be responsible for everything. How cruel. Jungmin laughed in agreement, but she preferred to stay quiet for the meantime. Jungmin had to duck just in time to avoid getting spotted. How could she have forgotten why she'd left Jungmin in the first place? Jungmin was the type of person to give ranks to friends who were just trying to play. That was the type of person she was. Once she thought she was above another person, she treated them like trash. It made sense to think that way, right? After all, who would declare their evil intentions outright? Jungmin was so sure all they wanted was a reason for tormenting her. And the way they pretended to be nice? It was so disgusting. Jungmin beat herself up mentally for falling for it at all. Jungmin and her minions were a bunch of jerks anyway. Moments later, Jungmin kept her eyes to the ground as she walked past Jungmin and her friend, and things would have stayed just fine. But they didn't. Jungmin's friend suddenly called Jungmin's name and she froze on the spot. When she turned around, the girl quizzed her about the length of her skirt. Ironically, her skirt was longer than both Jungmin's and this other girl's in comparison. You'd understand now why Jungmin was shocked and confused that the girl would bring it up at all. Around her, other people had begun murmuring, opinions flying through the room. Everyone seemed to be looking at and talking about Jungmin Choi. This made Jungmin's blood boil with anger. Had Jungmin stopped so low that she thought it'd be cool to make fun of her skirt? Jungmin clenched her fists by her side as she gritted her teeth in anger. She had a sharp retort dancing on the edge of her lips, but she couldn't say it. Instead, she whirled around and dashed out of the room as fast as she could. Jungmin remarked on how she was ignoring them, but Jungmin knew better than to reply. Victims of bullying were not permitted to return the gesture. And so, Jungmin turned to the one thing she could do to avoid going crazy: ranting on social media. In a class much later that day, Jungmin couldn't concentrate. She worried it was because of her lucid dreams. Her eyes were very heavy with sleep, and just while she was about to nod off in sleep, the teacher announced the area of concentration for the class test. Jungmin sat up in alarm as she realized she'd not paid any attention at all. And everyone was writing. She had no idea what. The board was blurry, the letters and numbers whirling into each other like the threads of a black hole. She gave up. She couldn't concentrate no matter how hard she tried, so she figured she'd just take a nap instead. Once she drifted off to sleep, the teacher promised to let the class go off early so they'd get ready for sports. While the rest of the class was changing into their sports uniforms, Jungmin was still sleeping. Unfortunately for her, Jungmin and two of her evil friends were just in the corner, and they considered leaving the class without waking Jungmin up. The lie about Jungmin being a primary school bully came up again, and one of the friends couldn't believe Jungmin was capable of being bullied by someone like Jungmin. After their little gossiping, they concluded they'd rather go to the canteen and leave Jungmin to handle her own problems. They mocked Jungmin on their way out and sounded so excited that Jungmin would get in trouble for skipping sports. While they walked out of the class, Jungmin suddenly asked them to go on ahead without her while she stopped by the nurse's office. They were confused and asked if she'd gotten sick, but she explained that she was only on her period. Her friends empathized with her and promised to put in word for her with the PE teacher. They parted ways after promising to keep in contact through text. Jungmin waited until they'd gone a little further away and then returned to the classroom. Jungmin was still asleep. She walked up to her and stood silently for a moment. Her eyes held a hint of kindness in them as she looked at her old friend. Or did they? She recalled Jungmin had been typing away on her phone and looked around for it. The device was laying carelessly under Jungmin's desk. Junhyun took it out and realized it didn't have any security. Not that Jungmin had any friends or family to be wary of anyway. She loomed over the sleeping girl and said she should have been nicer to her in the past. Afterwards, she turned away with the phone and began snooping through it. She found the online rants, but those weren't enough. Junhyun took out her phone and took pictures of Jungmin's phone screen. Sometime later, Jungmin was startled out of sleep by the sound of the teacher's voice. He asked her if she'd slept through the last period, and Jungmin realized with disdain that it was already time for dismissal. The teacher asked her to come straight to his office the next morning and turned back to Junhyun while Jungmin bemoaned her fate. How come no one had woken her up? She felt so lonely. On her way out of class, Junhyun called out to her, flashed her a creepy smile, and said she'd see her the next day. Jungmin stood in surprise as Junhyun and her minions walked away. Junhyun had never spoken to her before. All she'd done was laugh from behind her friends. What was her plan? Meanwhile, on the way home, Junhyun stopped her friends by the side of the road. She'd given some thought to the idea of revenge, and she was ready to make Jungmin pay for her sins. She confessed that it still hurt to remember the things Jungmin had done, and that there was no better time to get revenge than in the moment. Lies. Such exaggerated lies. Her cronies were elated, of course. They'd been so sure she had it in her. After all, she had every reason to be mean to Jungmin, right? They made her feel good about herself and promised to help her with her revenge plan. In their shallow thoughts, they were sure the whole class hated Jungmin Choi as well. Can you imagine that? Junhyun thanked them with a smile. The next day, Jungmin looked at her reflection in the mirror, the weight of the last period incident still heavy on her mind. She'd not realized how late she'd woken up for school that morning and considered washing her fringes to get out the grease. But that'd only make her go later than she already was. Her mind flashed back to Junhyun's face from the previous day, and she was instantly nauseated. She could only hope she'd have her peace for the rest of the day. When she got to school, Junhyun and her minions were laughing loudly at the back of the class. She'd taken the back door, so they were just right in her way. When she asked for them to let her through, Junhyun aged she could have just taken the front door instead. After spitting some more hateful words at her, she asked her to just get lost. While she was still standing, Junhyun asked if she had to look so depressed all the time. But it didn't stop there. Jungmin's decision not to wash her hair came back to haunt her, and Junhyun capitalized on it to mock her. Jungmin stood in silence, too embarrassed to actually speak. Junhyun asked her to cut off the bangs so she could see because they apparently were covering her eyes. Jungmin couldn't believe her ears. Junhyun called her filthy and asked her to just go away if she couldn't help herself. Did this girl just insult her simply because she'd skipped taking a bath for one day? The class went wild with murmurs, and Jungmin was right in the center of their conversation. Everyone seemed to think Junhyun had the right to get angry with her, and for some reason, someone brought up the twisted story about the bullying incident. Jungmin flinched in realization. She was never going to escape this new life she'd stepped into. So she turned around on her heels and dashed out of the class. She cussed away at Junhyun for being so cruel. She'd taken the bar so low just to hurt her feelings. As the years trickled down her face, Jungmin made a promise to herself. She was going to kill Junhyun. Back in the classroom, Junhyun and her minions were having a victory lap. They thought it was cool that she'd used the right words to attack Jungmin. They found it absolutely hilarious. Jerks! Junhyun laughed with accomplishment and offered to take the group out to dinner since she had her mother's card. Her friends gushed over how generous her mother was. Junhyun was still reeling with satisfaction from her accomplishments. She also had one more card up her sleeve. When she'd picked up Jungmin's phone the previous day, Junhyun took photos of all the comments she'd made about her and her friends with the intent of exposing the account. She only wondered if it'd do the damage she intended. Jungmin lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling aimlessly. She already dreaded going to school the next day. She couldn't wait to sleep and get her revenge on Junhyun in one of those lucid dreams. Just as she was about to shut her eyes, she heard someone punch in the security code at the door. She looked up and found her dad walking into the apartment. She welcomed him home, but he couldn't have cared less. He arched straight for the room he shared with her mother. Jungmin could already tell what was going to happen. She just sat still and counted down in her head, waiting for chaos to be unleashed. The sound of her father beating up her mother filled her ears and she shuddered in pain. She wondered why he even bothered to come home if he'd just end up turning her mother into a punching bag. He was responsible for the state of their lives. She clenched her fists under the sheets as she wondered if things would have turned out differently if her father wasn't well. The way he was. If she wasn't weak, if she had power, would she be able to stick it up to Jungmin and her friends? The sounds of violence kept ringing in her ears until they stopped. She wondered if it was really over, but her body was tired and she was pulled under the carpet of sleep. She opened her eyes and realized she was dreaming already. She could sense dreams easily since she'd begun lucid dreaming. She didn't even try hard these days. Her eyes were droopy with sleep, but she had something important to do. She'd never tried it before. She let her legs carry her through the house and into her parents' room. Her father was raining blow after blow on her mother. She went with her impulse and yelled at him to stop being a jerk. He snapped his head in her direction and moaned about how she'd become disrespectful to him. He commanded her to come up to him, and when she resisted, he marched up to her and lifted his hand to beat her up like he'd done to her mother. But before he could land the hit, Jungmin grabbed his neck and squeezed hard like her life depended on it. She was fascinated and excited as she realized she was actually hurting him, just as she'd thought. She poured her thoughts into her hands and willed him to die on the spot. And then, almost instantly, his neck snapped and she seemed to regain her senses. She stared at his lifeless body in shock, her eyes brimming with tears as she willed him to just wake up. She couldn't believe she'd just killed her own father. The thought drove her insane and she let out a gurgling scream as she shot up into a sitting position on her bed. It was morning already and been dreaming. She'd nearly forgotten. She flinched at the sound of movement and looked up to find her father. He smiled at her and slowly walked up to her bed. She heaved a sigh of relief, almost still skeptical that everything was okay. Jungmin stayed back to wash up before going to school. She ran as fast as she could, fully aware that she was in so much trouble. She could almost sense the teacher embarrassing her in front of the class. She thought death was a better option if she had to choose. She kept her head down on the road, the fear of her teacher's punishment fueling every step until she bumped into someone. She quickly apologized in passing and carried on running away. Ironing was lucky enough to arrive just before the bell. By this time, her hair was a mess again, and she was soaking wet with sweat. All eyes were on her as she walked into the classroom. She tried to fix her hair as best as she could and stopped when she heard someone say she'd not washed her hair. Imagine that. And she was called names and even insulted. But she'd washed her hair all right. She couldn't dry it because she'd been in a hurry. But just how many people could she have explained to? She just ignored their senseless gossip and tapped on her phone. She ranted and vented her anger out in her words online where she could remain anonymous. That was the only way she could relieve her stress. She was equally as sorry for herself. Jungmin waltzed into the class and called her name from as far as the door. Jungmin turned her head with dread in her eyes as Jungmin made a very dramatic entrance. She shoved her phone in Jungmin's face and confronted her about her anonymous account online. Jungmin's eyes went wide in horror. How had she been discovered? Cold sweat broke out on Jungmin's face as her mind went back and forth with questions. How did Jungmin find out? She'd kept her account private and anonymous, so she was the only one who knew it was hers. To make matters worse, Jungmin recognized the initials and the tone of the posts. It had to be Jungmin. Jungmin tried her best to feign ignorance and deny the accusation, but Jungmin wouldn't back down. She called the individual initials and identified them one by one. She was even more convinced Jungmin was responsible for the posts because she had the most distaste for her and her friends. And then, boom. The timestamp was very recent. Jungmin had been typing on her phone only moments ago. Jungmin read the posts aloud, much to Jungmin's disdain. The rest of the class were shocked to hear the words Jungmin had written. She insisted the account wasn't hers, but Jungmin wasn't buying it. She asked her for proof, to pick up her phone and show it to her. Jungmin was more horrified than she'd been before. There was no escaping this. While she was still dealing with the shock, Jungmin unexpectedly snatched her phone from her and began scrolling through it. Jungmin tried to wrestle it back, but she didn't have much of a fight left in her. Jungmin's eyes lit up with a satisfied smile. She'd seen just what she was looking for. Jungmin was logged into the same account she'd confronted her over. Now the whole class believed she was a freak. It was over. Jungmin shook with emotion as she mumbled Jungmin's name before the unexpected happened. Jungmin slapped her hard on her face. The whole class paused in shock. Jungmin was frozen herself. Junyun looked down at her and asked if she still wished to deny the glaring truth. Jungmin could hear the sound of the blood rushing up to her head as everything else went silent. What had she really done to deserve this kind of treatment? Scenes from her life flashed before her eyes like a dream. She couldn't help but wonder why Junyun was hurting her so much. What crime did she commit? A little later, she dragged herself off to the teacher's office and let herself into the room. He was surprised to see her. Jungmin asked him if she could go home since she felt ill. The teacher flashed her an incredulous look because she'd just gotten to school. He wouldn't let her go and insisted she attend all her classes for the day. He reminded her that she was still in his bad books for missing gym the last time. He told her she'd have been dealt with properly in his own days. With that, he shooed her away. Jungmin went back to her class and put her head down on the desk to sleep. She slipped into a lucid dream, and there in the dark as usual was Junyun. She walked over to her. After everything she'd had to endure, she'd made up her mind. She'd thought about why she couldn't hate Junyun. It wouldn't make sense to anyone else because she was the real victim. She grabbed Junyun by the hair, unsure whether it was the right thing to do. It was a dream after all, right? Nothing she did would compare to the evil she had to endure at Junyun's hands in real life. So, there was nothing to be remorseful about. It was her dream, her world, and in it, she was God and the law. She had the final say. While Jungmin dreamt, the rest of the world carried on without her. A girl in class made a comment about her sleeping habit, but another didn't find it surprising. Maybe it was because Jungmin had a learning impairment. The first girl laughed at the slight and wondered if Jungmin was really sleeping, but her friend didn't care. In fact, she wished Jungmin would hear the nasty things they had to say. Just to make sure, she turned around and yelled aloud at Jungmin, telling her that she'd never go to college or get a good job if she kept her sleeping habits. The girls laughed at their mean joke and walked away. Almost immediately, they'd left, Jungmin sat up. She'd heard the whole thing. Her classmates picked on her even more often than before. She wished she could destroy them. All of them. She still hated Junyun the most, but the other girls had begun picking on her one by one, and it made her angry that she couldn't just kill them. Hurting Junyun in her dreams had given her some comfort initially, until it just wasn't enough. She wanted more. Her mind flashed back to the dream where she'd killed her father, and she wondered if she'd been so shaken because she'd killed someone. Or was it because it had excited her? There was only one way to find out. She made up her mind not to care anymore. If she wanted to do something, she'd just go ahead with it. After all, she was only dreaming. But she was still conflicted inside her heart. Had she given up her sleep for lucid dreams just and ended up the way she was? There was no point in it. She figured she'd rather stop because nothing was going to change. That was a fact. Nothing she did to Junyun Ha in her dreams ever affected her in real life. Nothing. The thrill of watching Junyun's face as she fought for her life? It was all a dream. A farce. In the end, it was Junyun's choice to be nice to her in the real world. Meanwhile, as Jungmin faced her dilemma, a figure in the corner spotted her and found her quite interesting. A couple of days passed, and Jungmin had gotten used to the bullying from her classmates. She brushed her hair with a smile as she prepared for school. She didn't feel as bad as she used to before. Since she'd gotten used to everything, the dreams were getting less draining. As she walked into class that morning, she overheard a classmate asking if anyone had heard from Junyun. Jungmin offered a brief, curious glance in their direction. Junyun wasn't picking calls either. Jungmin mused over the news and concluded it was best for her that her mortal enemy was missing. She hoped things remained that way a little more. Permanently. The teacher came in almost immediately and asked the class to settle down for announcements. Once everyone was in their seats, he informed them that Junyun's parents had called to say she'd been involved in an unexpected accident and was rushed to the emergency room. Jungmin was stunned. Junyun's friends were hysterical almost instantly. The teacher sighed at their drama and explained further. Junyun's mother had said she'd just lost consciousness and started bleeding out in the middle of the night. For a reason we must believe to be obvious, this detail seemed to strike a chord in Jungmin's head. While the rest of the class huddled in small groups to talk about Junyun's misfortune, Jungmin couldn't get her mind off the coincidence. It made no sense to her. Then realization struck her. She couldn't believe it even as she thought about it. But she wondered just what if her lucid dreams were responsible for Junyun's accident. She wondered if she could really control Junyun. You see, Even when people know something can't happen, their desperation often leads them to believe that an ordinary coincidence is a miracle. Her eyes lit up with excitement as she fantasized about having superpowers. Everyone in class suddenly turned in the direction of the door, and when Jungmin followed suit, she felt very foolish for her silly fantasies. Strolling into the class like nothing had happened was Junhyun herself. Her friends rushed up to her and enveloped her in a tight group hug. Jungmin looked down in disappointment. A round of questions flew between them as they wanted to know how she'd fare, like they really cared. Jungmin was sick of their fake kindness. She could see straight through it. She tried to ignore the girls, but as Junhyun began narrating how she'd gotten the injury, her attention was piqued. Junhyun spoke about having a dream where she'd been chased fine and stabbed by someone with a knife. She'd felt the pain in real life and collapsed as a result. And then she'd woken up with blood coming from her stomach. It had been days since it happened, so she could barely remember, but she recalled seeing a man with white hair. Jungmin was confused. She tried to stay quiet and unnoticed, but Hyejin spotted her. She walked up to Jungmin and confronted her about eavesdropping on their conversation. She accused Jungmin of being insensitive. Jungmin had almost forgotten she was always a victim of bullying because everyone had moved on temporarily. But apparently, everything had returned to normal. Hyejin ordered her to get up from the chair. She told Jungmin that looking at her face made her feel like killing her. Junhyun stepped in false righteousness and asked her not to waste her time on Jungmin. Then she turned to Jungmin and asked if she'd been pleased to hear she wasn't in school. She told her that everyone disliked her because she was so creepy. A simple work of karma. And just like that, the three friends walked away, leaning Jungmin behind. Yuju teased Hyejin and hailed Junhyun as a saint for stepping in to stop their friend from hurting Jungmin. A saint? Jungmin's ears reeled with repulsion at the word. Who would ever have called Junhyun Ha a saint? What about her face made them wish her dead? The next time she was in a lucid dream, she confronted Hyejin for her nasty comment. If only the girl knew what looking at her face made her feel. There was only one way for her to find out. She was going to do the same thing she'd done to Junhyun to her? A knife appeared in her hand, and she wished another coincidence would happen just like it happened with Junhyun. Just as she was about to strike with the knife, she heard a voice behind her asking if she wanted her wish to come true. Jungmin quickly turned around and saw a man with white hair. She was confused. How did he make it into her dream? And he was moving towards her. Jungmin desperately reached for control in her lucid dream as she tried to stop this strange man. She couldn't even recognize him. He closed the distance between them in a heartbeat and remarked that she looked flustered because she'd lost control of her dream. She couldn't control him even if she tried because he wasn't one of her creations. The man cut to the chase immediately. He called her by her name and admitted that he liked her. He promised to make everyone who picked on her disappear if she wished. Jungmin quickly recovered from her shock and demanded to know who he was and how he'd made it into her dream. The man told her he'd assumed she was going to stick to simple methods and be aggressive with her dreams. But instead, she'd kept a calm and suspicious air about her. While he was still talking, Jungmin grabbed him by his shoulders and asked if he'd seen everything. He paused in confusion, and she asked him how long he'd been watching her for. He was amused and asked if she was scared he'd tell someone else about her dreams. No one would even believe him if he went about yapping about an ordinary dream. Besides, he wanted to help her not get her in trouble. He lowered her hands off his shoulders when he was done speaking. Jungmin had a few other questions she had to ask. What was his name? How did he enter her dream? To be fair, he hardly looked like a god of any sort. He agreed with her on the last part before saying anything else. She clearly didn't recognize him. Jungmin didn't quite get his statement, and he brushed it off before falling silent momentarily. Then he began speaking again. He was certain Jungmin had read some articles about lucid dreaming in the past. Then he asked if she knew who this man was. She mulled over the question before it finally struck her. Now, you see, this man is a character in every lucid dream who enters and leaves as he pleases. The dreamer had control over everything except this man. But Jungmin had assumed it was all urban legend. Someone had actually proved it to be wrong. But could it be? The man said she was safe to think of him as this man. Jungmin didn't think he looked anything like the pictures she'd seen on the internet. This man stood more upright and flipped the table on her. He had questions of his own. He asked if she wished to serve justice by his side, even if it meant liking Junhyun and her friends. Jungmin was skeptical. Who was this guy? Why was he asking her these questions? And then she recalled Junyun's conversation with her friends back at school about the man with white hair. She flinched in recognition, and the man asked what she was staring at. He teased her for being drawn to his beauty. It was normal for anyone to go head over heels for him at first contact. But while he was still speaking, Jungmin made a dash for it. He realized she was getting away and called out to her. Jungmin was so shaken. The man had a weird aura about him, and she was very certain he was the same white-haired man Junyun had seen in her dream. If he was the one, she really fancied asking him to make the girls disappear forever. But something inside of her didn't trust him. If she was being logical, she'd been friends with Junyun in the past, and look at where they were now. She could only imagine how much worse it'd be with a total stranger. The more she thought about it, if her suspicions about his identity were true, then she was better off staying away from him. The man looked at her retreating figure and smiled. At school the following day, Jungmin sat by herself in class. Hijin yelled at her to stop looking at her and cursed at her to eat bricks. Yuju jokingly said she was going to make Jungmin cry. But Hyejin justified her cruelty by saying Junyun had called it karma, and Jungmin was very deserving of every bit of it. How evil! Jungmin kept silent to her slur of insults, and this seemed to amuse Hyejin. Yuju reasoned it was probably because Jungmin had gotten so used to getting cussed out, unlike the other day when she'd been shaking. Yuju pat Jungmin on her head and mockingly gushed about her getting used to school life. Hyejin slapped her hand off because she found it irritating as touching a cockroach. But Yuju laughed and asked if Hyejin still had a stomachache. She offered to pat her to health with the hand she'd put on Jungmin's head, and Hyejin ran away in disgust. Junyun stepped into the class, and her classmate, Eunju, informed her that the homeroom teacher had asked for her to come to the teacher's office since she was class president. Junyun thanked her and went on her way. Eunju praised her for being an intentional president who knew everyone's names already. Eunju's friend could only help but wonder how knowing another person's name made one nice. She knew everyone's names as well. Eunju also mentioned Junyun's academic prowess back in middle school, but it seemed the lady knew something that her friend didn't. She knew Eunju would get mad at her for the slightest reason, so she'd rather keep her mouth shut. After the final class of the day, Jungmin was glad to be on her way home. She was relieved to be leaving school, but she didn't want to go home either. Contrary to Yuju's remarks, she'd not become quiet because she'd gotten used to being bullied. She'd only realized that the more angry she got, the greater of an outcast she became, and she didn't have the courage to show her anger in public. Unlike the Jungmin in her dreams, she was just a sore loser that no one acknowledged. She'd figured that if she didn't react, they'd get bored and leave faster. Because her head was angled to the ground as she walked, she spotted when a note slipped from the person ahead of her. She wondered what was on it. The guy ahead was on the phone, but she went up to him anyway and flashed the note in front of him. He accepted it from her with relief, but she'd only made this interaction in her head. She flipped the note around and saw it was only just a sticker. She figured it'd be weird to just stop him for an ordinary sticker. She looked at the odd cartoon character and wondered what it was. Jungmin wondered if he'd get creeped out if she just approached him. What if he'd thrown the note on purpose and she was the one being nosy? The boy finally realized and began searching his pockets for the sticker. He was pretty hysterical as he searched for it. Whoever he was speaking with over the phone didn't think the off-band cartoon character was worth anything. He snapped at them for talking down on his sticker. Apparently it was part of a collector's edition, and he'd spent a lot on it. His friend jokingly said it was probably a sign for him to give up his interest in knockoff cartoons. He asked his friend to hang up so he'd go searching, but his friend had gone against his mother's instructions to get 1 hour on his computer for their promo project. He ended the call in anger. Jungmin walked up to him with the sticker, and he thanked her with relief in his eyes. He asked for her name and age, which she provided. Coincidentally, they were the same age. He asked if they could speak less formally. He recognized her school from her uniform. Jungmin was amazed that she'd just made a friend by picking up a sticker. He said she could talk to him casually, and all Jungmin could wonder about was if he didn't think she was creepy. He looked closer and said he'd seen her before. Jungmin was surprised. He was the same student she'd bumped into one morning while she was running off to school. Jungmin was embarrassed that he rejected the incident. He introduced himself as Jaehyuk Ko and asked if he could say hi if they crossed paths with each other in the future. Jungmin agreed, and Jaehyuk smiled in acknowledgement. Jungmin found the sudden turnaround of events in her day pretty interesting. She felt so awkward it was hard to form words. But she didn't dislike it either. She couldn't remember the last time she'd spoken with another person for as long. She mulled over his name with a smile as she waved him goodbye. As Jungmin walked to school, she thought about her lucid dreams. After the white-haired man showed up, she'd found it difficult going back to her dreams. She still couldn't figure out his identity, no matter how hard she tried. As she walked, she was so engrossed in her thoughts that she didn't hear Jae-hyuk sneak up on her until he jumped right in her path. He apologized for the surprise. She jumped with a start at the sudden proximity. They said their hellos and Jungmin looked away with a blush. Jae-hyuk proposed that they'd go to and return from school together. Jungmin could still remember his words from their last meeting. She'd concluded he was hit being polite, but here he was saying hi, just like he'd asked to. Jae-hyuk commented on the skies and thanked Jungmin for letting him walk to school with her. One look at him, and Jungmin could tell he was from an entirely different world. That in itself was a problem. They walked together in silence for a while, and just when Jungmin was starting to feel awkward, Jae-hyuk began a conversation. He told her he'd been on the phone the last time they'd met, and after they finished speaking, he called back. He asked if she'd heard about League of Legends, and Jungmin said she had. Apparently, Jae-hyuk and his friend were supposed to go on a promotion series together, but since he'd said he was going to join much later because of the missing sticker, his friend must have played without him. He'd called back later and was angry with Jae-hyuk because he'd lost. Jae-hyuk found it hilarious that his friend would blame his loss on him. Jungmin laughed a little cluelessly because she didn't have the slightest idea how else to reply to him. Jae-hyuk felt bad for his friend and planned to play with him after school. He was so free with his speech, but if only he knew the mental war Jungmin was fighting inside her head. When she finally managed to provide a response, it didn't sound convincing to even herself. It felt like she'd not been paying attention the whole time. She slumped her head in shame and disappointment. She couldn't think of the right response. How had she changed so much? She could remember how different she'd been when she was younger. She let out a disappointed sigh as she realized he'd stopped talking altogether. Jungmin could see he'd grown tired of her already. He must have felt silly for trying to be friends with her. Jungmin accepted her fate and defeat. After all, she'd never have expected herself to talk with a boy normally. But Jungmin wasn't ready to lose their friendship just like that. Suddenly, an idea flashed in her mind. The sticker she'd picked up. She asked Jae-hyuk if he liked the cartoon because she was interested in cartoons herself. And of course, this was a lie. But a girl's gotta be a girl in the end. She asked what the cartoon was called, and his enthusiasm instantly returned. He was surprised that she'd shown interest in the cartoon because his friends didn't really care. He applauded her taste. Jungmin blushed and admitted that she'd only seen it for the first time when she picked it up, but she'd found it cute. Jae-hyuk agreed with her because that was the same reason he'd begun watching it. But for him, it was more than just a cute cartoon. He found it funny and actually learned some moral lessons from watching it. He'd even cried while reading an episode of the cartoon. Jungmin noticed the title sounded like a knockoff version of a much popular cartoon. And while she was thinking this, Jae-hyuk said he hated that his friends criticized the cartoon for being an imitation of the more popular title. He'd made it a point of duty to read the so-called plagiarized comics, and he'd discovered they had no similarities at all. He just wished his friends would read the comics themselves. He recommended the comic to her and asked her to let him know if she read it. Then he realized he'd forgotten to ask for her number the last time. Jungmin gave it to him, still struggling to believe she wasn't in a dream. Her phone rang and he told her to save his own number. She smiled with a little blush, grateful to have a friend of her own. They arrived at her school first. Jae-hyuk asked her to go inside even though he was sad they had to part ways because he had so much to talk to her about. Jungmin was surprised to learn he'd enjoyed talking to her. And no, she hadn't heard wrong. Jae-hyuk was indeed happy he'd talked with her and still had a lot to say. He asked if it was okay for him to call after school so they'd go home together. Of course, Jungmin agreed. Who wouldn't? Just like they'd agreed, they walked home together more often, and Jungmin grew more comfortable with Jae-hyuk. On one of those days after they'd walked back home together, Jungmin let herself into her apartment with a smile on her face. Jae-hyuk talked about the cartoon again. Jungmin found it interesting that he could like something with so much passion. She considered watching the show for herself and ended up enjoying it. She texted him afterwards and told him she'd watched it and found it really interesting. Jungmin had never felt this way before. The girls in her school were still as mean as ever, but she didn't mind. She had Jae-hyuk. He made her feel her best self. But of course, this new development wouldn't have gone unnoticed by Jungmin's enemies. They soon noticed she was always smiling at her phone and wondered if she'd turned to using drugs. Hyejin wondered if she'd gone back to talking bad about them on social media. Yuju thought that'd be pretty audacious given how they'd dealt with her the last time she'd liked such a stunt. Hyejin whined about how annoying Jungmin was, and Yuju suggested she'd just take out her anger on the girl by crushing her like she crushed other kids back in the day. Hyejin flinched in irritation and queried Yuju for just casually bringing up the past, especially when it wasn't even a good one. Junyun suggested they return to the classroom since school hours were finally over. Junyun walked home alone after school, and one could only imagine the shock on her face when she saw Jungmin and Jaehyuk laughing and talking together. Seeing her old friend laugh like that brought back memories from their childhood. She felt instantly jealous. Who was Jungmin hanging out with? Junyun sized the guy up as she began to slowly put the pieces in place. Jungmin's recent behavior, the new habit of smiling at her phone. It all made sense now. The guy had to be responsible for the newfound sense of hope Jungmin had found. Junyun's face dropped into a deep scowl. She hated the fact that Jungmin was having fun. She tried to wave it off. Junyun had become bored since Jungmin had refused to react to her taunting lately. But just then, an idea came to her mind. What if she could get Jungmin to be betrayed by the people she trusted just like she was? The following day, after class, Jungmin sat by herself and racked her head for the next subject on the timetable. It was math. She rose from her seat to leave the class and nearly bumped into Hyejin at the back of the class. She dreaded her encounter with the girl already, but much to her surprise, Hyejin sighed angrily and walked out of the way. Jungmin was shocked. What had gotten into Hyejin? Jungmin waited for a curse that never came. Jungmin glanced over her shoulder as she mulled over the fact that she'd been bullied a lot less in recent times. Junyun and her clique had stopped picking fights with her, so the rest of the class seemed to have lost interest as well. But one thing stayed the same. She was still glaringly lonely. At least school wasn't as bad as it used to be, all thanks to Jaehyuk. Her phone beeped and she took it out to find a text from Jaehyuk. Someone had put a sticker of the villain from the cartoon on his desk and he didn't like it. He wanted to make them pay for being so mean. His classmates always made fun of him, but Jungmin was different. She was the only one who actually listened to him complain. Jungmin found it funny and laughed aloud to the hearing of her classmates. Nobody bothered her directly anymore, so she smiled more often. It was goodbye to her lucid dreaming days. Of course, a big reason why she'd abandoned lucid dreaming was because the man had suddenly appeared in her dream. She found it spooky. A little while later, Jungmin sat by herself in class and zoned out for a bit until the sound of her name popped up in her head, and she looked up to see two of her classmates. She recognized the girl with the glasses and her companion and wondered why they'd come up to her and hoped they didn't want to bully her. One of them sat down across from her and asked why she'd been smiling a lot at her phone lately. Jungmin quickly put up her defenses, regretting that she'd let her guard down a little too much. It wasn't hard to think some people didn't exactly like seeing her smile. But the girl's next words hit her as a surprise. She said it was nice to see Jungmin smile. Her eyes flew wide in surprise. The girl continued by saying Jungmin should have started smiling ages ago because it was really nice to see her like that. As if she'd not had enough surprises for one day, the girl asked if she wanted to hang out with them. Had she heard them right? Was this another dream? The second girl asked why Jungmin looked so surprised, because it was that obvious. She didn't think Jungmin had anyone else to hang out with anyway. Her friend asked her not to talk about Jungmin like that because it was Hyejin's fault that Jungmin didn't have a lot of friends. Jungmin was a little anxious. She asked them for their names because she'd never know. The girls were astounded, almost offended even. Jungmin was more anxious because she feared she'd messed everything up already before it even started. How could she not know the names of her classmates? Jungmin apologized and listened carefully as they introduced themselves. The girl with the glasses introduced herself as Sora Choi and her companion as Yoonju Seo. They compelled her to remember their names and asked for her to come with them to the snack shop. Jungmin had been too surprised to react immediately until they asked her again. She rose from her seat hesitantly, still in disbelief as she asked if she was really allowed to go with them. They looked at her incredulously, and Yoonju asked if she hadn't heard a word of what they'd said. She asked her to come with them and quipped that she couldn't stand Sora whining about being hungry. Jungmin was more than glad to join them, and even at that, she walked a reasonable distance behind them. She still found it hard to believe she was actually hanging around these girls. She was also skeptical and feared that the girls had other intentions. But she gradually let her guard down as they only went to the bathroom together and even ate lunch together. And, well, nothing out of the ordinary happened. They went to the snack shop afterwards, and Jungmin found the moment so special that she let all her guards completely down. After school, Sora pleaded with Jungmin for some money, and Eunju called her out on it. Sora explained that she still had till a week until she received her allowance. She asked if Jungmin would be patient for that long, and Eunju called her out for her borrowing habits. Sora tried to explain that both her parents were away on a business trip, so she didn't have access to her allowance until they returned. But Eunju wasn't having it. She didn't think it was okay for Sora to go about borrowing money from other people because it was going to give her a lot of trouble in the real world. Sora just had to grow up and quit borrowing. Sora was shocked to hear her friend talk to her the way she had. She asked if she hadn't paid people back in the past. Why did Eunju have to make harsh comments all the time? Jungmin sensed the rapidly building tension and quickly intervened. She told Sora that she could pay her back slowly and asked what she wanted to eat so she'd pay for both of them. She even offered to pay for Eunju as well. Sora quickly seized the opportunity and made her request. Jungmin heaved a sigh of relief, grateful that the two girls hadn't fought eventually. She reasoned that if she'd be friends with them, then she'd constantly have to play the mediator. After packing up her bag, she spotted her new friends and walked up to them to ask if they were walking back home. She suggested that they'd walk together with her and her other friend if the two girls were going in the same direction. But the girls weren't going home. They were hanging out together over the weekend, so they wanted to go check out makeup and clothes together. Jungmin was surprised to hear they were hanging out together. Sora explained that they were attending the grand opening of a new amusement park. Jungmin nodded in understanding, but she secretly wondered if this wasn't the same Sora who only moments ago didn't have money for her lunch. Jungmin asked if she could come along, but Eunju let out a loud scoff. Jungmin was confused and asked what the matter was. Sora quickly jumped in to explain that she would enjoy the event because she wouldn't know what to do, and Eunju quipped that she wouldn't have any fun even if she came along. They asked her to go home instead of forcing herself and ending up bored at the event. Jungmin couldn't believe her ears and her eyes. Had she just been played? Sora cheerily waved her goodbye as they walked away. Jungmin stuttered her response. She felt bad, but she tried to make excuses for the girls. They'd been friends together longer than they were with her. She knew they'd been friends even as far back as grade school, so it made sense that they were closer to each other than they were with her. Jungmin turned around and began walking home. There was no point in being too sensitive. It couldn't be as deep as her mind was painting it to be. Want to know what happens next? Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next part. Drop a comment below if you're excited for more, and tell me what you think of the crazy lucid dreams. Thanks for tuning in, and see you in the next video.